cargo hold smelled like cold metal and oil. Connor Vail sat on the floor with his back against a fuel drum and a paper notebook open on his knee. He was writing numbers, lengths of cable, weight of stripped copper wire, mass of 2 broken engine coils he had pulled from a dead freighter 3 weeks ago. He wrote the numbers slowly and carefully. The way a man writes when writing is the only thing keeping his hands from shaking. The Kessel drift station groaned around in the way old stations always did, a low, deep sound that was not quite mechanical and not quite alive, somewhere between the two. It was the sound of metal under stress. Connor had worked on drifting stations most of his adult life, and he had learned to read those sounds the way other men read weather. This one said, nothing new, just cold, just pressure, just the ordinary suffering of a structure built to last, and lasting anyway, out of stubbornness and mass. He heard the docking clamp before he saw anything. A heavy industrial sound. 3 beats. The kind a martial vessel made when it locked on with full authority, rather than the polite single beat of a merchant. Connor did not move. He put his pen in the fold of the notebook and listened to the footsteps come down the corridor. There were 2 sets of them. He could tell by the weight and the rhythm that both wore hard-soled boots and that neither was in a hurry. The whole door opened. 2 figures stood in it, wearing the gray and silver uniform of the Galactic Order's Civil Enforcement Division. They were not Vorkai. They were Genocide, tall, faintly blue-skinned, with the wide, flat eyes of a species evolved in low light. The one in front held a data board. The one in back stood with his hands loosely at his sides, which was a universal posture of someone who expected no trouble but was ready for it. Connor Vail, said the one with the data board. His voice was precise and dry, like a man reading from a list. Registered operator of the independent salvage vessel cautious number. Registry code K, 441 drift. Is that correct? Connor said it was correct. Under Galactic Order Emergency Provision 7 Echo, enacted 3 months ago following the reclassification of the human species, all property and registered assets held by persons of human origin are subject to provisional seizure pending status review. The Genocide lowered the board and looked at Connor with something that was not unkind. This includes your vessel. We are here to take possession. Connor looked at the floor for a moment. Then he looked up. Is there paperwork? There is always paperwork, the Genocide said. Then give me the paperwork. He signed where they told him to sign. He did not argue. He did not raise his voice. He walked with them back to the docking corridor, and he stood on the station side of the airlock, and he watched through the small round window as his ship, 7 years of work, the thing that had taken him from Earth's outer rim to the far side of the Kessel Belt, was undocked and pulled away by the martial tug. It was gone in 40 seconds. The airlock window filled with nothing but stars. Connor stood there for a while. Then he went back to the cargo hold, sat down on the floor, and picked up his pen. He kept writing numbers. He had very little left now. A duffel bag, 3 changes of clothes, a toolkit worn down to its most useful components, a paper notebook with 43 pages of inventory that no longer meant anything, a folded photograph he had not looked at in 3 months because he already knew what was in it, and looking did not change what was in it. His wife's name was Karen. His boys were named Owen and Pete. Owen was 9, and Pete was 6. They had been in the Ganymede colony when the Vorkai ships came. Connor knew exactly how long the bombardment of Ganymede had lasted, because it was a number that had been broadcast on every emergency channel in the known galaxy for 72 hours. 2 hours and 14 minutes. He had been in the Kessel Belt when it happened. He had been running a routine salvage scan, listening to a recording of a baseball game from 3 weeks earlier, eating a sandwich. 2 hours and 14 minutes. He had not finished the sandwich. He did not think about this now. He wrote numbers, cable lengths, copper weights, the value of things that could be sold. He had been living on the station for 3 months now, doing small jobs for the dock managers, loading, unloading, hauling cargo that other species did not want to handle. He was paid in food credits and floor space. It was not a life. It was what came after a life. The part where you were still breathing, but the reasons for it were somewhere back in wreckage. He had not talked to another human in 6 weeks. There were a few others on the station, 3 that he knew of, but they kept to themselves the way all the surviving humans kept to themselves now. each one carrying something too heavy to talk about and too dangerous to put down in public. He found the signal on a Tuesday, or what he was calling Tuesday, because some habits die harder than others. He was running a charge test on a broken comm unit he had pulled from the recycling bin, not because he needed a comm unit, but because fixing things was something to do, and the unit flickered on with a brief burst of static, and then, for just under 4 seconds, played a signal. It was on a human emergency frequency. It was encrypted in a way that only old military hardware would decrypt, and the old military hardware in the comm unit's base code did decrypt it, because a man who had built the cautious number 7 years ago had bought a used unit from a surplus auction and never checked what firmware it had come with. The signal was a set of coordinates and 6 words in English. "We are not finished." And then silence. Connor sat with the broken comm unit in his lap for a long time. He did not write it in the notebook. He memorized it instead. Then he put the comm unit down and went to find a way off the station. 412 light years away, on a station of a very different kind, a woman named Lena Marsh was also being told that she no longer existed. The Meridian Spire was one of the oldest structures in the known galaxy, a neutral translation hub built in the period before the Galactic Order had fully standardized its communication protocols, back when species still needed living interpreters to speak to one another. It turned slowly in the middle of a gravitational dead zone between 3 star systems, massive and silver and covered in antenna arrays the size of buildings. 600 species had resident translators on the spire, or they had before 3 months ago. Now, there were 599. Lena's office was on level 44. It was a small room with a desk, 2 chairs, and a window that looked out at the stars from an angle that made it seem like the spire was tilted, though it was not. She had spent 4 years in that office. She spoke 11 languages fluently and could work adequately in 9 more. She had been in the middle of translating a trade negotiation between the Villani and the Chorus That Walks when the emergency broadcast had come through 3 months ago, and she had translated that too, because she was a translator and it was what she did, and because the alternative was to stop and scream, and she had not been ready to stop. Velok, the station administrator, was a small Genocide man with very careful eyes. He came to her office on a gray morning. Space had mornings if you set your sleep clock right, and he sat in the second chair, and he put his hands flat on her desk in a gesture that she had learned meant apology in Genocide body language. "Your residency credentials have been invalidated," he said. He said it the way you say something you have been practicing saying. "This is not an expulsion order. There is no expulsion order. You are not being told to leave." "But I am being told I have no right to stay," Lena said. "You are being told that the legal framework which gave you the right to stay no longer applies to you." Velok's careful eyes moved to the window and then back. "The reclassification. The extinction decree. The reclassification," he said again gently, "means that the standard residency protections of the Order do not extend to persons of your origin. Whether you stay or go is now a matter of local discretion." Lena looked at him for a moment. "Velok, what happens to people who have no legal standing? In practice, what actually happens?" He was quiet for several seconds. "In practice," he said carefully, "they become invisible, and invisible people are subject to whatever the visible people around them choose to do." After he left, Lena sat at her desk for a long time. Outside her window, the stars turned at the slow pace of the spire's rotation. She pulled up her work terminal and looked at the translation queue. 3 jobs waiting, a Genocide legal document and 2 commercial contracts, and she thought about how she had spent 3 months doing her job as if doing her job meant something, as if the routine was a wall she could put between herself and the fact that the world she came from was gone and the world she was in did not consider her a person. She had recorded everything. From the first day after the bombardment, when the Order had convened its emergency session, she had used her translator Access, which ran to every official channel on the Spire, to record every word of every debate. She had transcripts. She had the original broadcasts in 17 languages. She had the votes and the vote totals and the names of every delegate who had said yes to the extinction decree and the exact words they had used. She had put it all in a file and named the file simply the procedure and locked it behind 3 levels of personal encryption. She had not known what she was going to do with it. Now she thought she was beginning to understand. She found the signal the same way Connor did, by accident. She had a habit of running background scans on quiet frequencies as white noise while she worked, a habit from her early training when her supervisor had told her that a translator's ears should always be doing something. The signal came through on a human military emergency band, brief and encrypted, and her terminal decoded it automatically because her terminal had been set up by a human technician 4 years ago who had loaded it with every decryption key he could find, on the general principle that more was better. 6 words, a set of coordinates. We are not finished. Lena read the signal twice. Then she packed a bag. She did not tell Vail she was leaving. She left her translation queue open and her office light on, so that anyone looking at her door would see the light under it and assume she was inside, working, being invisible in a quiet, useful way rather than the dangerous kind. The coordinates pointed to a debris field in unclaimed space, a wide band of rock and dead metal between 2 uninhabited systems that no one had ever bothered to name. It was the kind of place that appeared on charts only as a hazard warning. Getting there required 2 commercial transports, a relay station hop, and a final leg on a cargo drone that Connor had talked a Villani dock worker into loaning him in exchange for 3 hours of unloading work and a very convincing story about a navigation test. He drifted into the debris field on low power, navigating by feel and by the faint trail of heat signatures left by something larger that had recently moved through. The rocks around him were old, older than any human civilization, probably older than the Order itself, dark and cold and indifferent. He had his toolkit, his duffel bag, a week of food credits in his pocket, and the notebook. The photograph was in his jacket, folded in the inside pocket over his heart, because that was where it had been for 3 months, and he had stopped noticing it there the way you stop noticing a scar. He almost missed the ship. It was sitting in the shadow of a rock the size of a city block, dark and cold and deliberately so. No running lights, no heat signature above background. It was a generation ship, one of the old ones, built in the early days of human expansion, designed to carry 1,000 people across decades of travel. It was enormous and ugly and looked, in the dim starlight, like a building that had grown tired being a building and decided to become a mountain instead. The name on the side had been painted over, but not completely. He could read part of it, Artemis I. He docked at the secondary airlock on the port side. Someone had recently oiled the clamps. He noticed this because it was the kind of thing a careful person did, a person who thought about the small things that gave away a position. Inside there was light, dim and warm, running off what sounded like a very quiet generator. The corridors smelled like humans, coffee and skin, and a particular combination of anxiety and determination that Connor had smelled on salvage crews before a dangerous dive. He followed the light to a common room on the second level that had been set up with folding tables, mismatched chairs, a water recycler, and a map of the known galaxy covering most of one wall with 7 systems circled in red. There were 44 people in the room. Connor counted them twice, the way he counted things when he wanted to be sure. Some were in military clothes that had been modified to remove identifying marks. Some were in civilian work gear. 2 of them, a boy and a girl who could not have been older than 17, were sitting in the corner sharing a blanket and a meal bar, watching the room with wide, quiet eyes that had seen too much. Lena Marsh was already there. She was standing near the map with a cup of something hot, listening to a conversation. She glanced at Connor when he came in the way you glance at a new face. Quick assessment, no judgment. File for later. At the center of the room, sitting on a folding chair with his legs crossed and a cup of coffee on the table beside him, was the oldest man in the space. He had gray hair, a short beard, and the kind of face that had been weathered by decades of something. Not weather, decisions. He was reading a physical document. Paper, printed, folded, and he did not look up when Connor walked in, but Connor had the immediate strong impression that the man had registered him and already decided what he thought. His name, Connor learned in the next few minutes, was Gus Farrow. Gus let the new arrival settle. He waited until Connor had found a chair and Lena had moved to the edge of the group and the 17-year-olds had finished their meal bar. Then he put down the document, picked up his coffee, and spoke. "I am going to tell you 3 things," Gus said. His voice was quiet and even, the kind of voice that did not need to be loud because it was never going to waste a word. "The first thing is what I know. The second thing is what I think. The third thing is what I am asking you to decide. He paused. Nobody spoke. What I know, 11.4 billion human beings were killed in a coordinated orbital bombardment over 72 hours 3 months ago. The Vorkai hegemony carried out the attack. The Galactic Order convened an emergency session. After 4 days of deliberation, 4 days, the Order voted by a margin of 31 to 14 to classify humanity as extinct. The surviving humans, us, and roughly 140 million others scattered across the galaxy, were reclassified as stateless persons with no legal standing under Order law. Everything we owned was seized or frozen. Every protection we had was removed. We became, in official terms, a problem of local discretion. He looked around the room. You already know this. I am saying it out loud because it is important to say things out loud. Several people nodded. The boy in the corner had stopped eating. What I think, Gus continued, is that the Vorkai did not act alone. He let that sit for a moment. I spent 22 years in human military intelligence. Before the bombardment, I had been retired for 4 years. I was growing tomatoes on a station above Titan and reading history books, and I was very happy about this. But I kept my contacts, old habits. He picked up his coffee. In the weeks after bombardment, I started pulling threads. The Vorkai had motive. They called humans destabilizing, irrational, unpredictable. But they had motive for 5 decades, and they never acted before. Something changed. Someone said yes to something they had been thinking about. He put down the coffee. I have found evidence, not proof, evidence, that 3 senior members of the Order's governing council communicated directly with Vorkai High Command in the 60 days before the attack. I do not yet know exactly what was said. What I know is that the communication happened on encrypted channels, that it was frequent, and that it stopped completely the day the bombardment began. He looked around the room again. The genocide was not spontaneous. It was a policy decision. And the people who made that decision are currently sitting on the Order Council, helping to administer the extinction decree. The room was very quiet. Connor became aware of the generator's sound, steady and low, underneath everything. What I am asking you to decide, Gus said, is what kind of people you want to be for the next part of this. I am not asking you to decide today. I am asking you to stay here long enough to hear more, to understand what we are looking at, and then to make a real choice. I am not going to tell you what to do. That is not what this is. He looked at the map on the wall. But I will tell you this. We are small. We are scattered. We have no ships, no weapons, no governments, no rights. We have very little. He paused. I have found that very little is often exactly enough, if you know what to do with it. That night, Lena could not sleep. She sat in a narrow bunk in one of the old passenger berths, and she thought about the file on her terminal. The file she called the procedure, and she thought about what Gus had said, and she thought about Velok's careful hands flat on her desk, and she thought about the word invisible. She was a translator. She had spent her professional life making sure that things said in one language could be understood in another. The Order's deliberations have been conducted in 17 official languages, but the heart of it, the real reason, the ugly procedural logic that had turned 11.4 billion deaths into a reclassification event, that had only ever been said in the language of bureaucracy, which most species never learned to read. She could read it. She could translate it into every language anyone cared to listen in. She got up in the dark and went to the common room and found the terminal that Gus had set up, and she started working. Connor found her there at 4 a.m. He came for water and stayed because he did not have anything waiting for him in the bunk. He sat across the table from her and watched her work for a while without asking what she was doing. She told him anyway. I have recordings, she said, not looking up from the screen. Everything the Order said in that 4-day session. All of it. Every speech, every vote, every procedural motion. In the original languages with timestamps and delegate identification. Connor looked at the screen. She had a transcript open, text in a language he did not know, with handwritten annotations in the margins. What are you going to do with it? He asked. Translate it. She finally looked up. Her eyes were tired but steady. Not for us. We already know what was said. For everyone else. For the genocide journalist on my station who asked the administrator a question and was told it was a complicated matter. For the Villani trade delegates who voted yes because they did not understand that yes meant the end of something. For the Vorkai civilians who had been told their government performed a sanitation event and nothing more. She looked back at the screen. I am going to make it impossible to say you did not understand. Connor thought about this. That will make you a target. I am already a target. Everyone in this ship is a target. At least this way we are a target that has done something worth being targeted for. She typed a line of text and deleted it and typed it again. My job is language. The thing they used to erase us was language, a word, reclassification. That sounds technical and neutral and means nothing until you translate it into plain speech. Translated into plain speech it means we watched 11.4 billion people die, and then we completed the act on paper. She stopped typing. Her hands were still on the keyboard. I am going to translate it into plain speech. In every language that matters. Connor did not say anything for a while. Outside the common room's small window, the debris field moved in its slow eternal drift, rock and metal, and the occasional glint of something that had once been a ship. My wife's name was Karen, he said. He did not know why he said it. He had not said her name out loud in 3 months. Lena looked at him. My boys were Owen and Pete. Owen liked to take things apart. He was always doing that. Taking apart whatever you find, figuring out how the pieces worked. Pete couldn't sit still. He ran everywhere. Everywhere. He stopped. He picked up the water cup he had come for and held it. I am not going to talk about it more than that, but I wanted to say their names. Owen and Pete, Lena said quietly. Yes. She went back to her translation. He sat with her while she worked, drinking water, watching the debris drift. After a while, he picked up a spare notebook on the supply shelf and started sketching a map of the neutral corridor near the Vorkai border. Something had been doing in his head for 2 weeks. The slow, patient work of a man planning something he had not named yet. In the following days, Gus told him more. He had spent 3 months not wasting a single hour. He had maps of Vorkai supply lines, the physical infrastructure that moved goods and fuel and munitions through the 9 hegemony systems. He had charted the Order's diplomatic dependency network, showing which species were most heavily tied to Vorkai trade. He had the personnel files of the 3 council members he suspected, compiled from public records, and a few sources he did not name. He had a list of the Vorkai's most significant infrastructure vulnerabilities. He did not present this as a plan for attack. He presented it as information, laid out on the table, available for thinking about. I want to be clear, Gus said on the 3rd day, when enough people had asked him what he was suggesting. I am not interested in a war. We cannot win a war. The Vorkai have 9 star systems and a military with a clean record. We have a generation ship with a questionable fuel supply and 45 people, most of whom are not soldiers. He looked at Petra Calloway, who had been a Marine and who had been making this point repeatedly. I understand the desire to bleed them. I understand it very well. But bleeding them buys us one moment of feeling like we did something, and then they find us and we stop existing even in the unofficial sense. I am not willing to spend the people in this room on a moment. Petra, who was 26 and had the lean, coiled posture of someone who had been training to fight since she was 15, looked at him steadily. Then what are you willing to spend them on? Something permanent, Gus said, something they cannot undo. This was when he explained what he actually wanted to do. He wanted to expose a connection between the 3 council members and the Vorkai High Command, not in a broadcast that would be ignored or suppressed, but in a way that the galactic public, all 600 species, the ordinary civilians who did not make policy, but who ultimately determined what their governments would get away with, could not avoid seeing and could not misunderstand. He wanted to take Lena's translation work in his own intelligence files and build something so complete and so clear that any species who encountered it would understand exactly what happened. Not a sanitation event, not a reclassification, but a planned murder of civilization, approved by the people who were supposed to be maintaining order. That alone doesn't get our people back, someone said. A man named Ray Elliott, an older engineer who had the steady, worried eyes of someone who built things for a living and was accustomed to thinking about what went wrong. No, Gus said, but it changes what we are. Right now we are extinct. We are officially nothing. They finished us on paper, and they think the paper is the last word. He folded his hands. Paper can be rewritten, but only if enough people see the original and decide they do not like what it says. Connor had been listening to all of this from the corner where he usually sat. He had been drawing in his notebook, not maps now, something more detailed, a schematic, supply line junctions, relay points, the places where Vorkai logistics infrastructure passed through neutral space. On the fourth day, he asked Gus a question. How long does the main Vorkai supply chain run to the neutral corridor between Sector 7 and 9? Gus looked at him with the eyes of a man who had been waiting for this question. Continuously, it's their primary fuel resupply route. And the infrastructure in that corridor, the relay stations, the routing beacons, who maintains them? Technically the Order. Practically no one. They're old, automated. Connor nodded slowly. He looked at his schematic. I need 3 people who are good with small-scale installation work. Nothing complicated. Just hiding things. What kind of things? Gus asked. Transponders, Connor said. Small ones. Nothing that transmits anything harmful. Nothing that broadcasts anything loud. Just listening devices, basically things that sit in the infrastructure and record what passes by them and hold the data until you ask for it. And when do you ask for it? Connor looked at the map on the wall. The Vorkai border was marked in the upper right corner, a red line curving through 2 star systems. When we're ready for them to know we were paying attention, he said. Gus looked at him for a long moment. Then he made a small sound that was not quite a laugh, but was the nearest he seemed to get to one. You'll have your 3 people. That night, Lena finished the first section of her translation. She printed it. The ardent silence had an old printer that complained about everything but worked, and she read it aloud to herself in the empty common room. She read it in English first, then in Genocide, then in the quick-clipped syllables of Alani trade speech. The words were plain and simple in every language. She had worked hard to make them that way. The Order's deliberations had used long, complicated words that slid past the eye without leaving a mark. She had taken each long word apart and replaced it with small ones. She had made it impossible to read without understanding. She folded the pages and put them in her bag. She would need 3 more months to finish. She was willing to take 3 months. There was a window in the common room that faced a different angle than her old window on the spire. Through it, she could see the debris field stretching out in every direction, the ruins of things that had once been other things, rocks that had once been planets, metal that had once been ships. It was the ugliest view she had ever had, and she found herself standing at it every night for the same reason she had stood at every window in her life. Because windows meant there was somewhere to look, and looking meant the universe was still there to be looked at. 11.4 billion names. She did not know most of them. She did not need to know them. They were the reason the window mattered. Connor was already in the neutral corridor by the time anyone else had slept. He traveled light, 1 pack, 1 toolkit, the schematic in his notebook, moving through the relay stations in the dark the way a salvage operator moved through wrecked ships, slowly and with a great deal of attention to what was stable and what was not. The first transponder went into the wall cavity of a routing beacon in Sector 7 Junction, tucked behind a panel that had not been opened in 14 years by the look of the dust. It was smaller than his palm. It made no sound. It would sit there and listen, and remember, and say nothing until it was asked. He moved to the second junction. His boots made no sound on the old metal floors. Above him, through the corridor's narrow viewing port, the Vorkai border lights glowed. The automated beacons that marked the edge of the Gemini's claimed space, red and slow and steady. He worked without hurry. He had learned a long time ago, in the years before everything changed, that the jobs worth doing were the ones worth doing slowly. His boys used to watch him work sometimes. Oh, and especially, always asking questions, always wanting to know how each piece fit with the next. Connor would explain it step by step, the same way his own father had explained things to him. Here is why this matters. Here is how it connects. Here is what it becomes when you are patient with it. He put in the third transponder and sealed the panel and stepped back and looked at the corridor. Nothing visible had changed. That was exactly right. He found a spot near the viewing port and sat down on the floor with his back to the wall. Through the port, the Vorkai border lights kept their slow red pulse. He watched them for a long time. He was not angry looking at them. He had thought he would be, being this close to the edge of the space that the people who killed his family called home. But what he felt was not anger. It was something quieter than anger, and harder than anger, and far more durable. It was patience. He pulled out his notebook and opened it to the schematic page. He added a small mark for each of the 3 transponders. Small, neat circles, the kind of mark a careful man made when he was keeping track of things that would matter later. Then he closed a notebook and put it in his jacket pocket over the folded photograph, and he sat in the dim corridor with the red lights pulsing slowly on the other side of the glass, and he waited for the time to come when waiting would be finished. It was not finished yet, but it was beginning. The other people on the Ardent Silence were doing their own kinds of work in those days. Ray Elliott had found the ship's old engine room and was running diagnostics on the secondary drive coils, checking what worked and what would need to be replaced, humming quietly to himself the way a man hums when the work under his hands is the only thing in the world that makes sense. 2 former soldiers named Carl Pruitt and Diane Walsh were going over the station's limited supply manifest, figuring out how long 45 people could last on what they had, and what they absolutely needed to find more of. A woman named Gloria Reeves, who had been a doctor at a clinic on the outer belt before the bombardment, moved quietly around the ship checking everyone's health one by one, not because she had been asked, but because she was a doctor, and doctors noticed when people needed things they had not asked for. The 2 teenagers, a boy named Sam and a girl named Audrey, who had been in cryo storage on a colony transport when the attack came and who had woken up to a galaxy that had erased their families while they slept, spent most of those early days close together, not talking much, watching the adults with a particular alertness of young people trying to understand what kind of world they had landed in. Gus paid attention to them in a quiet way. He paid attention to everything. He made sure they had food before he took his own. He did not try to explain things to them that could not yet be explained. He simply made sure they knew they were counted. In a generation ship buried in a debris field, a woman was translating a genocide into plain speech. In a neutral corridor on the edge of Empire, a man was planting the first seeds in the counting. The galaxy did not know this yet. The galaxy had written them down as extinct, had filed them away, had moved on to the next item on the agenda. The galaxy would learn, in time, that extinct and finished were not the same word, not even close. Connor Vail had gotten good at it. He knew how to walk through a crowded station without anyone looking at him twice. He knew which vendors did not ask for registration chips. He knew which corridors had camera gaps, which alien security guards checked documents, and which ones just waved people through because they were bored and their shift was almost over. He had learned the texture of invisibility, the way you had to make yourself small and quiet and unremarkable in a universe that had officially decided you did not exist. He did not think about what that meant anymore. He had made a choice, somewhere in the 2nd month, to stop thinking about what it meant and to focus only on what needed to be done. There was always something that needed to be done. The cell he ran now had 7 people. They operated out of a repurposed cargo hauler called the Doris K, which had been registered to a Genocide shipping company for 11 years, and was therefore, officially, nothing to do with humans. The ship smelled like recycled air and old machinery. Connor had stopped noticing the smell. He was sitting in the engine room, going over route calculations, when Petra Calloway came down from the upper deck and dropped herself into the chair across from him. She did not say anything at first. She just sat there with her arms crossed, watching him work. Connor kept his eyes on the screen. He had learned that when Petra wanted to say something, she would say it eventually. Trying to rush her just made her dig in. She was 26 years old, and she had been a Marine for 4 years before the bombardment. She had been on a training exercise in deep orbit around Titan when the signals went dark. She had watched the emergency broadcast alone in a training pod, unable to do anything, unable to reach anyone. For 11 hours before her vessel was recovered by a Genocide patrol ship. In those 11 hours, Petra had made a decision about what she was willing to do, and she had never fully unmade it. Connor respected her. He also knew she could get them all killed if he was not careful. She said finally that she had been looking at the patrol schedule near the Vorkai logistics hub at the edge of a neutral corridor. She said there was a gap in their coverage every third rotation, about 40 minutes, and that a well-placed strike on the hub's fuel processing unit would knock out supply runs to 3 of their forward bases for weeks. Connor put down his screen. He looked at her. He said he knew about the gap. He had known about it for 2 months. Petra stared at him. She asked why they had not used it. He told her the same thing he had told her 3 weeks ago, and 2 weeks before that. He told her that the moment humans struck a Vorkai military installation, the Order would stop calling them refugees. They would start calling them combatants. The Vorkai dissidents who had been quietly making noise inside their own government would have no more ground to stand on. Every alien journalist who had republished Lena's document would suddenly have a reason to walk it back. The sympathy they had spent 6 months building, carefully, painfully, would evaporate in the time it took the first news signal to reach the core systems. Petra said that sympathy did not bring back 11 billion people. Connor said he knew that. She leaned forward. She said she was not asking him to feel better about it. She said she was asking him what the point was of being careful and patient and precise when 11 billion people were already dead and no amount of documents was going to change what the Vorkai had done. Connor was quiet for a long time. Outside the hull, the stars did not move. He said the point was that destruction fades. He said that when you destroy something, it becomes a story. Stories change with each telling. They get softened or exaggerated or forgotten. But a record does not change. A record sits there in the open, available to anyone, for as long as the civilization that holds it survives. He said that what Lena had built was not a weapon. It was a wound that would not close. And a wound like that in the right place was worth more than any strike on any fuel depot. Petra looked at him for a moment. Then she got up and went back upstairs without saying anything else. Connor picked up his screen. He went back to the route calculations. His hands were steady. He added a name to the list in his jacket that evening, as he did every evening. The name was Dale, an engineer from Wyoming who had been with the cell for 8 months and had a habit of humming old folk songs while he ran maintenance checks. Dale had been captured 6 weeks ago during a supply run near the Kessel stations. The Vorkai security forces had found 2 other humans with him. None of them had come back. The list had 34 names on it now. Connor folded it very carefully along the same creases every time, so that it would last. On the other side of the galaxy, Lena Marsh was eating cold noodles at a desk in a borrowed office inside the Genocide Institute for Cross-Species Communication at a university that had been operating for longer than humanity had been writing things down. The office belonged to a professor named Sovren, who was 73 years old in Genocide years, which translated something close to 110 in human terms, and who had a mild, interested manner of someone who had spent a very long time watching civilizations do things, and had long since stopped being surprised by any of it. He had given Lena the office 6 months ago, after reading her document, without being asked and without explanation. He had simply handed her a key card and told her the hours were flexible. Lena had not asked him why. Some things you accepted. She was working on the second broadcast. The first one, released 4 months ago, had been procedural record of the Order's internal deliberations in all 17 galactic languages, with her own translations appended. She had called it simply the procedure. It had traveled to the Galactic Communication Network in a way that genuinely disturbing things travel. Not with speed exactly, but with a kind of unstoppable steadiness, passed from inbox to inbox, from news platform to news platform, carried forward by the simple weight of its own content. Governments had denied it. Then they had declined to comment on it. Then 3 of them had quietly commissioned independent translation audits, which confirmed her work was accurate. The Vorkai hegemony had issued a statement calling it fabricated, which had lasted exactly 2 weeks before a Vorkai dissident group leaked internal communications that matched the document line by line. For months of work, and the Order had not yet moved, but the ground was shifting. Lena could feel it in the way the communications coming into her encrypted channel had changed. In the beginning, the messages had been a mix of human survivors checking in and alien voices, expressing what she privately called safe sympathy, the kind of sympathy that costs nothing, because it is never followed by action. Now the messages were different. They were more specific. They asked questions about procedure, and about what a formal challenge to the extinction decree would require under Order Charter law. They came from lawyers, from politicians, from junior diplomats who were not willing to put their names to anything publicly, but who were clearly being pointed in her direction by people who were. She had also received, 3 weeks ago, a message that was not like any of the others. It was short. It came through a channel she had set up for human-only contacts, on a frequency that required a specific authentication sequence that only 11 people knew. But the sender identifier was not any of those 11 people. It was a single symbol from the Vorkai military communication system, which Lena recognized because she had spent 4 years translating Vorkai diplomatic texts and had made it her business to learn their codes. The message said, in Vorkai logistic notation, that a specific cargo manifest number was available for review and that the review window was limited. Lena had stared at that message for a long time. Then she had forwarded it to Gus. Gus Farrow was 61 years old and did not have a fixed location. This was not an accident. He moved between 6 different identities across 4 different star systems, staying nowhere longer than 3 weeks, never using the same communication route twice. Connor knew he existed. Lena knew he existed. Most of the other humans in the network knew only that there was someone coordinating from above, someone who occasionally sent very specific instructions that turned out to be exactly right. Gus had spent 22 years in military intelligence before retiring to what had been, until 8 months ago, a quiet life of consulting work and fishing. He had a daughter. She had been on Earth when the bombardment happened. He did not speak about her. When Lena's forwarded message arrived, Gus was sitting in the galley of a small transport vessel registered to a Norathi freight company, eating something that tasted approximately like eggs. He read the message. He read it again. He put down his fork. He had been waiting for this contact for 4 months. He had not told anyone he was waiting for it, because the kind of waiting he did was not the kind you explain to people. You either trusted the thread or you did not. And Gus had learned 20 years ago that explaining the thread usually meant someone pulled on it too hard and broke it. The contact inside the Vorkai High Command was a logistics officer named something unpronounceable in human phonetics, whom Gus had been cultivating through 3 layers of intermediaries since the 2nd month after the genocide. The officer was not a defector. Gus was very clear about this distinction. Defectors had ideals. This officer had calculations. The calculation was simple. The hegemony's current trajectory, given the economic pressure from the trading partners who had cooled their relationships since the genocide became public, given the internal dissent that was growing louder every quarter, given the formal diplomatic crisis talks that had been demanded by 4 member species of the Order, that trajectory ended in institutional collapse within 12 years. The officer had a family. The officer had a pension. The officer wanted the hegemony to survive, and had concluded that the cleanest path to survival ran through accountability. Gus respected this. He found pure pragmatism far more reliable than conviction. The cargo manifest number, when decoded, turned out to be a filing reference. What it referenced was a complete internal Vorkai military record of the genocide authorization, including the communications between the 3 Order Council members and the Vorkai High Command, including the signatures, including the date stamps that placed those communications 4 days before the bombardment began. Gus read through the file for 3 hours. He checked the authentication markers twice. He sent one message to Lena that said, "Prepare the 3rd broadcast." He sent one message to Connor that said, "Stand by." Then he sat in the galley for a while and thought about his daughter. He thought about the sound she made when she laughed. Then he put that away and went back to work. On the Doris K, Connor received Gus's message and showed it to no one. He called the cell together and told them they were changing course. He gave them the new coordinates without explanation. Petra looked at him across the table, and he could see in her face that she knew something had shifted, though she did not know what. She did not ask. For once, there was a man in Connor's cell named Roy, who was 44 and had been an orbital navigation engineer before the bombardment. Roy had a talent for silence that Connor appreciated. He also had a very specific skill set involving communication relay arrays that had turned out to be extraordinarily useful over the past 6 months. It was Roy who had planted 14 of the 17 transponders in the Vorkai supply infrastructure. He had done it without fuss, on what looked to anyone watching like routine salvage runs. Roy asked quietly, as they changed course, whether the waiting was over. Connor thought about how to answer that. He said the waiting was not over, but the first part of it was, Roy nodded and went back to his station. The Doris K reached the rendezvous point 2 days later. It was a nothing place, a stretch of unclaimed space with no stations, no traffic, no reason for anyone to be there. A second ship was already waiting. It was a small vessel that Connor did not recognize, registered to no one, and flying dark. A single person came across in a transit pod. Connor met her at the airlock. She was not what he expected, though he had not formed clear expectations. She was short, dark-haired, and wearing clothes that looked like they had been bought at 3 different stations with no attention to consistency. She looked like a graduate student. She looked, Connor thought, like the least threatening person he had ever seen in his life. He had been around enough dangerous people to know that this was not an accident. Her name was Ren Cole. She was 33. She was a former signals intelligence analyst who had been working a contract job for a private xenotech firm near the Outer Rim when the Genocide happened. Gus had found her in the second month, and she had been running the technical side of the broadcast operation ever since, from a location she did not share and on hardware that was, she had once told Gus, so thoroughly masked that she could broadcast from inside a Vorkai security station, and it would read as background noise. She handed Connor a data chip. She told him that Lena had the 3rd broadcast ready. She said it was set to go out in 14 hours, synchronized across 600 relay points simultaneously, so that no single point could be shut down fast enough to stop it. She said that Gus wanted Connor to know that the timing of this one mattered more than the previous 2, because this one would land inside an active order session. Connor turned the chip over in his hand. He asked what was on it. Ren told him it was a direct communications between the 3 council members and the Vorkai High Command, fully authenticated, with the signatures and the dates. She said it was a proof that the genocide had not been a Vorkai decision made in isolation. It was an order decision made with order authority and order foreknowledge. Connor stood in the airlock corridor for a moment. He thought about 11 billion people. He thought about Dale humming in the engine room. He thought about the marshal who had come to take his ship 6 months ago, with the paperwork already filled out. He told Ren to tell Gus that he understood. Lena released a 3rd broadcast at the agreed time. She was sitting in Sovren's office with her translation interface open and her hands flat on the desk. She had been awake for 30 hours. She had checked the authentication markers so many times that she could have recited them from memory. She pressed the transmission key and watched the signal propagate across the relay network, blue lines spreading outward on her monitoring screen, like water finding its way through cracks. She thought about the first time she had sat in a translation booth at 22, fresh out of graduate school, doing real-time interpretation for a trade negotiation between a Thranosai mining consortium and a Norathi distribution network. She had been terrified of making a mistake. She had spent the whole session holding herself absolutely still, as if any movement might disturb her concentration. The lead negotiator afterward had told her she had done well. She had walked to the bathroom and stood over the sink for 5 minutes before her hands stopped shaking. The hands were not shaking now. She did not know whether that was because she had gotten better or because she had used up the part of herself that shook. The response to the 3rd broadcast moved faster than anything that had come before. Within 6 hours, 3 Order member species had issued public statements demanding an emergency session. Within 12 hours, the session had been called. Within 20 hours, the 3 council members whose signatures appeared on the document had released individual statements denying the authentication. By the time those denials reached the public, Gus's contact in the Vorkai High Command had quietly delivered the original source documents to the Order's independent verification body, which was a small and underfunded office that had never, in its 200-year history, been asked to do anything this significant. The verification office confirmed the authentication in 36 hours. The 3 council members resigned before the confirmation was made public. The Order session that followed was the most attended in Order history. Every member species sent full delegations. The chamber, which had been designed to hold 300 representatives comfortably, held 412. The feeds from the session were watched on 11,000 platforms across 38 star systems. No humans were present in the chamber. They were not permitted. They did not legally exist. Lena watched the session feed on a small screen in Sovren's office. The old professor sat beside her, drinking something warm that smelled like cardamom. not saying anything. The chamber debate went on for 9 hours. It was not clean. It was not the kind of dramatic moment that stories usually build toward. It was procedural and slow and full of technical language and parliamentary amendments. Several delegations tried to table the motion on grounds of improper evidence submission. Several others argued that the extinction classification was a separate matter from the genocide charges and should be addressed independently. A Norethi delegate spent 40 minutes arguing about the specific definition of the word authorization under Order Charter law. Lena translated every word to herself, under her breath, out of habit. At hour 7, a Genocide delegate named Overensol, who Lena later learned was one of Sovereign's former students, stood up and said something that cut through procedural noise. Overensol said that the Order had not simply failed to stop a genocide. The Order had, by the evidence now before the chamber, participated in its planning, and the Order had then responded to that genocide by declaring the surviving victims to be legally non-existent, which had the effect of protecting those responsible from any claim that might be brought by the harmed party. Overensol said that this was not an administrative error. It was a system behaving exactly as it had been designed to behave, in service of the outcome it had been designed to produce. The chamber was quiet for a moment after that. Then the vote began. The motion on the floor was narrow. It did not address the genocide directly. It did not address the war crimes question, or the council members' liability, or the Vorkai hegemony's formal status. It addressed only the extinction classification. It asked whether the classification should be suspended pending formal investigation. Lena watched the vote tally build on her screen. It was not close. It was not the overwhelming, history-making majority that people would later remember it as, but it was not close. The classification was suspended. The investigation was opened. Humanity was recognized, provisionally, as a people still in existence. Sovereign said nothing. He just refilled his cup. Lena put her head down on the desk and did not move for a while. Petra heard the news on a short-range comm signal while she was sitting in the cockpit of the Doris K, doing what she had been doing a lot of lately, which was watching the space outside the viewport and thinking. Connor had given her the cockpit when she needed to think, which she appreciated without having been able to say so. She heard the broadcast announcement. She heard the language of it, the careful bureaucratic hedging, the way they said suspended rather than reversed, provisionally rather than permanently, pending investigation rather than concluded. She heard every word that was not there, everything that had not been said, every acknowledgement that had not been made. 11 billion people, 72 hours, sanctioned, coordinated, and approved. She had a list of her own, not written down, because she did not need to write it down. Her squad, 8 people she had trained with for 2 years. Their faces were as clear to her as anything she had ever seen. She could still hear their voices. The vote had not brought any of them back. She sat in the cockpit for a long time. The stars outside did not move. Nothing moved. Then, slowly, without quite deciding to, she started humming. It was something she had heard Dale do, a low, wandering melody that she could not name and did not know the words to. She had absorbed it somewhere in 8 months of shared spaces and engine room maintenance and long quiet hours in transit. It came out of her now like something that had been waiting. She hummed it all the way through, whatever length it was, and then she stopped. She uncrossed her arms. She put her hands on the console. She thought about what Connor had said about records and wounds and the difference between what burns and what stays. She did not know if she believed him. She did not know if it mattered whether she believed him. What she knew was that she was still here, and that Dale was not, and that the people responsible for that were now in the middle of a formal investigation that was going to take years and would be conducted in language she did not speak, by institutions she did not trust, in a chamber she was not allowed to enter. She decided, sitting in the cockpit of a stolen ship in the middle of empty space, that she was not going to wait for those institutions to finish. Not because she was going to burn anything down. She had listened to Connor. She had actually listened. She was going to find the Vorkai dissident contact that Gus's network had been quietly building a relationship with. She was going to learn their language properly, not just the tactical vocabulary, but the real language, the way you spoke when you were talking to someone you needed to understand you. She was going to make herself useful in the negotiation that was coming, because someone was going to have to be in those rooms speaking for the dead, and it was going to have to be a human, and she was still standing. It was not what she had planned for herself, but her original plan had died with the rest of everything, and this was what was left, and she found, sitting there with her hands on the console, that she could work with it. She went to find Connor. The formal war crimes proceedings were announced 3 months after the Order vote. They were the first such proceedings in Order history involving a silicon-based species, which the legal analysts all noted with careful neutrality, as if they were recording a weather event. The Vorkai commanders directly responsible for the bombardment were named as respondents. The 3 council members were named as co-respondents. The proceedings were expected to last several years. Connor testified for 11 days. He had not planned to testify. He had been contacted by the office of the proceedings through a channel that reached him through 3 intermediaries, and his first instinct had been to decline, because he had not finished what he was doing, and the courtroom was not where he did it. But Lena had sent him a message that said only they need to hear a human voice in that room. He had thought about it for 2 days, and then agreed. He sat in a chair that had been built for a species that was taller than him and narrower at the shoulders, and he answered questions for 11 days in a steady, flat voice that several journalists later described as unsettling in its calm. He was precise. He did not editorialize. He answered what was asked and nothing more. When the lead counsel asked him to describe his experience following the bombardment, he described it in factual terms, the sequence of events, the logistical realities, the decisions he had made, and why. When the counsel asked how many people he had lost personally, he said he had lost his family in the Ganymede colony, and that he would prefer not to characterize their deaths as a personal loss in this context, because he did not think that framing served the purpose of the proceedings. The counsel asked him what framing he would prefer. Connor said he would prefer to frame it as evidence. At the end of the 11th day, the counsel asked him if he had anything he wished to add. Connor reached into his jacket and took out a folded piece of paper. He unfolded it along the careful creases. He said he would like to read 14 names into the record. He read them slowly, without inflection, giving each name the same weight and the same space. When he was done, he folded the paper and put it back in his jacket. The counsel asked if those were the names of family members. Connor said they were the names of people who had been in his care and had not survived. He said there were more names, but that these were the ones he knew best. The counsel said the names would be entered into the record. Connor said thank you. Lena's appointment as provisional human representative to the Order came 6 weeks after proceedings began. It was not a real appointment in the sense of being elected or formally conferred. It was more that the Order's administrative body had reviewed its records and concluded that of the surviving humans whose identities were verified and whose locations were known, Lena was the one who had an existing file in the Order's own system, from her years as a translator at the Meridian Spire, and that this file, however thin, constituted a form of recognition that could be used as the basis for provisional credentialing. So Vren told her about the appointment while she was eating cold noodles at the desk in his office. He said it in the same mild, factual way he said everything, as if he were passing along an interesting piece of administrative trivia. Lena put down her chopsticks. She asked him how long he had known this was coming. He said he had suspected it for some time. She asked him why he had not told her. He said he thought she would have found a reason to decline if she had too much time to think about it. She sat with that for a moment. Then she asked him if he thought she would be any good at it. He said he thought she would be extraordinary at it in the ways that counted and miserable at it in the ways that were inevitable, and that both of those things were probably necessary. She arrived at the Order chamber on a morning that was neither cold nor warm, carrying a bag with one change of clothes, her translation interface, and a data drive containing the complete archive of everything she had documented over the past year. The chamber entrance was a tall, wide corridor built for species that were larger than humans, and she walked down alone, her footsteps small and clear in the silence. The seat she was shown to have been borrowed from a storage room and placed at the end of the human delegation table, which was otherwise empty. The table had been installed 6 weeks ago. It was the right size for a human, which she found, for reasons she could not entirely explain, very difficult to look at. She sat down. She opened her translation interface. Around her, the chamber filled with the sounds of species she had spent her career learning to understand, voices layered over each other in 17 languages, the ordinary noise of the galactic political machinery beginning its day. She thought about the first broadcast. She thought about pressing the transmission key and watching the blue line spread across the monitoring screen. She thought about 11 billion names in a file that took 47 hours to read. She thought about a piece of paper folded along careful creases. The session began. The moderator called the chamber to order in the common trade tongue, and Lena's interface translated it into the small private language of her own thoughts. She straightened in her chair. She looked at the chamber. It was full of people who had watched 11 billion of her people die, and had argued about paperwork. She was the only human in the room. She opened her notes. She began. Gus Farrow was not at the proceedings and would not be attending the sessions. His testimony file was sealed. The clerk who had processed the sealing request had written in her notes that the man was quiet and polite, and that he carried himself like someone who had made peace with a great number of difficult things. She had written this because she was thorough, and then she had filed a note and moved on to the next case. Gus was, at the time of the first session, somewhere that was not recorded. He had closed the accounts he had used for the past year. He had thanked the intermediaries who had carried his communications and made sure that their trails went cold before his did. He had sent a brief message to Connor and a brief message to Lena that both said the same thing. You do not need me for this part. He did not say where he was going. He did not need to. The work was done, or at least a part of it that required him was done. There would be more work in the years ahead. The slow, grinding work of legal proceedings and political negotiation, and the long labor of building something in the space where 11 billion people used to be. That was not his kind of work. That was the work of people who were better at hope than he was. He thought about his daughter on the days when he let himself think about her, which was not often, because often was too many times. On the days when he allowed it, he thought about her laugh, and the way she used to argue with him about everything, and the particular look she got when she was pretending to be exasperated but was actually amused. He kept those things in a part of himself that was private and untouchable and would remain that way. He was somewhere unremarkable. He was sitting somewhere, and the light was whatever color it was, and he was breathing, and he was still thinking, and that was enough for now. It was not a victory. Lena had told anyone who would listen that she did not want to call it a victory, because a victory implied that something had been won, and nothing that had been lost could be won back. What it was, she said, was a beginning, a record, a wound that had not been allowed to close and seal over, and eventually become a smooth place on the skin of history, where no one could tell that anything had happened. She said it was a beginning every time someone asked. She said it in 17 languages, because that was her job, and because the meaning shifted slightly in each language in ways that were important, and because she had spent her whole professional life believing that the right words, placed precisely, were the only lasting things in a universe that was otherwise extremely good at forgetting. The Vorkai hegemony entered its formal crisis talks. The trading partners who had cooled their relationships over the past year opened preliminary restoration discussions. The Galactic Network carried the story in a way that it had not carried anything in recent memory, with sustained attention that felt, to those watching, like something that was not going to stop. Somewhere in the outer rim, Petra Calloway was learning to speak Vorkai. She was not fast at it. The phonological structure was nothing like anything human, and some of the sounds required a kind of controlled breathing that she had to practice for an hour each morning before the shapes would come right. She was patient with herself about it, more patient than she was with most things. She had decided that it was necessary, and when Petra decided something was necessary, she did not make excuses. She was working with a small contact team, 2 humans and 1 Vorkai dissident who went by a name that translated approximately to still water, and they were laying the groundwork for what Lena's team would eventually need in the negotiating rooms. People who understood both sides from the inside, who could catch the things that translation software missed, who could tell when a word that meant one thing in official context meant something different in the room where the decision was actually made. It was not what she had trained for. It was not anything like what she had imagined for herself in the years before. But she was alive and she was moving forward, and forward was a direction, and a direction was enough. She kept humming the song when she worked. She still did not know its name or its words. It did not seem to matter. Connor submitted his final testimony on the 47th day of the proceedings. He walked out of the chamber into a corridor that was full of the ordinary sounds of an institution that had been doing its work for 200 years and was going to keep doing it long after everyone currently in the building was gone. He stood in the corridor for a moment. He took out the folded paper. He looked at the names, all 34 of them, written in a careful hand on both sides of the paper, in the order he had added them. He had been carrying this paper for 11 months. It had been refolded so many times along the same lines that the creases were almost cuts now, almost separations, and had reinforced them with a thin strip of tape that he had applied on a night when he could not sleep and had sat at a workbench carefully tending to the things that needed to last. He stood in the corridor, and he read all 34 names silently to himself, the way he did every morning. He took his time. He gave each name its own moment, its own weight, its own place in the air of the corridor where he was standing. When he was done, he folded the paper and put it back. He walked out of the building into whatever light was available, and he kept walking. The galaxy kept moving. The stars did not stop. The proceedings continued, slow and complex and unsatisfying in all the ways that proceedings on the thing they are addressing is too large for any proceeding to contain. The machines of the Galactic Order turned and debated and amended and tabled and returned and voted again, because that is what machines do, because the alternating is what the function is. And in the middle of all of it, small and stubborn and unreasonably present for something that had been officially declared extinct, humanity persisted, not loudly, not with flags or battle cries or the kind of defiance that makes for clean, satisfying stories. Quietly, the way water persists in stone, finding every crack, wearing every surface, patient in a way that stone is not built to withstand, not finished, not done, not gone.